Okay, this is Chris S. This is my presentation. I did it on Steve Reich. He was a minimalistic composer. His mother was a singer and his father was a lawyer, which later he said was he thought it was kind of funny because he learned that he was pretty much a mix between both of them. He was born in New York. His first influence in music was he and his friends went to see Rite of Spring, and he really liked it. He said the world changed color when he heard it, so that was his first inspiration. But he didn't decide that he wanted to actually get involved and start composing music until he saw Charlie Parker, and that's when he decided that he really wanted to start composing and make music his career. He first went to Cornell and then Juilliard, and then after he graduated, he moved to California to continue his career. He studied with Luciano Berio as a European 12-tone composer, along with Stockhausen and Boulez. Berio taught Reich in San Francisco. Because he studied with Berio, he had to write 12-tone music. But what ended up happening, instead of following the formula and changing out the patterns, he just repeated the same pattern over and over again. He was more interested by the rhythmic aspect rather than the melodic, and he ended up rejecting the 12-tone method. His whole thing was that, well, it's America, it's not Europe, it's a different time. We should be doing something new and different. Why pretend it's something else when it's not? He was inspired a lot by jazz, and the improvisation, how it uses the same harmonic sequences, but it never really gets stale because great melodies, different timbre changes, and the rhythmic complexity. Um, his first major work is "It's Gonna Rain." He recorded a preacher, and later when he played it back, he heard that when the preacher said "It's gonna rain," he heard a pigeon take off, and when the pigeon took off, with him saying "It's gonna rain," it kind of created like a drum beat sort of thing, with the preacher saying "It's gonna rain," like it's gonna rain, 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 and just over and over again. So what he decided he was going to do, he tried to turn it into sort of a canon. So he would play one and then set up another tape and play it back. But just by chance, they ended up starting at the same exact time, and they gradually separated, and then came back together. This is how he developed his signature technique, phasing, where two melodic patterns will fall in and out of sync. The interesting thing about phasing is that the ingredients are really simple. Like, you already know what's happening, but it's with the changes, the brain, how it comprehends the music, makes the music and makes it interesting. Okay, so after that, Reich realized that if it was just a machine that was doing it, then it would just be a gimmick. So he decided to write something that people could perform. So that's when he created piano phase. We're going to listen to a couple of seconds of this. It starts out off with one pattern, and then another person comes in, and then he plays the same pattern together, but one will gradually get faster than the other, and then it creates different layers. Okay, and that goes on, and then the phasing kind of shifts, and then you get to a part where it sort of locks up again, and then but on a different beat, and then things kind of get interesting. So as you can see, you had that new line created, bum 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 bum, when things were lined up in a different beat. After this, he went to Ghana to create his first large-scale work, phasing work called drumming. It's pretty much works out the same way. You had a set of percussionists on different African instruments, their marimbas and African drums, where some people would phase, some people would stay on the same beat. I had a sequence of events. One person would come in, then another person, then another person, after each line was completed. After this, he decided this was his final phasing piece. If somebody else wanted to do it, that was fine, but he wasn't going to write anymore. At this point, he wanted to combine his minimalistic techniques with harmonic and rhythmic elements to create music that delivers more of an emotional experience to the listeners. This is when he wrote Music for 18 Musicians, which I think is probably his most influential and successful work. His goal was he wanted to have a large group of people playing together without a conductor. So pretty much how that worked was everyone knew when to come in with their lines and their ideas, but they would all change when the vibe player came in. Once the vibe player comes in, that signals would change and everybody moved on to the next idea. This whole piece is the idea of something hovering or floating in space and, considering different aspects of itself before it moves on to something else. Creates something that's very, very rich and ethereal, I think, at least. Let's listen to a couple seconds at the beginning and then we'll move on to when it changes. Okay, and then that continues for a little bit, and then you can hear the vibe player comes in eventually, and then the whole thing shifts a little bit. So as you can hear, once the vibe came in, then the singers and all musicians, they changed what they're doing, and it just moves on. The same thing happens throughout the piece. I think it's just really interesting how the piece just sits and lets you realize that there's more happening in this piece than what you originally think, and I don't know, it's very light and you're just like you're floating. But I thought that was very interesting about the piece. His next piece was Different Trains, which actually won a Grammy. It compared and contrasted his childhood memories of his train journeys between New York and California with the different trains that were being used to transport the Jews to the concentration camps during World War II. In this piece, he used a keyboard sampler to input speech as musical elements. The woman's voice doubles with the viola, man's voice doubles with the cello. A quote from him about this, which I really liked. So I didn't have to try to express the angst of the Holocaust, which is impossible to do. I simply had people talk about their lives. So that quote kind of struck a chord with me. That piece had a pretty big influence with inputting the voice, which I'll talk more about that later. But he also wrote a piece called Electric Counterpoint for Pat Metheny. And I think all of his work was really influential to a lot of composers later, especially someone like John Adams. And you can hear his styles being used in a lot of pop music, but mostly influential in almost all electronic, ambient, techno, or trance kind of music. Like all that ethereal sound, and things kind of morphing from itself. That all that happens in a lot of trance music. And all this stems from Steve Reich. Okay, that's all I got. That was my presentation on Steve Reich.